Hello guys, welcome back. My name is Nathan and today I'm going to be making my final 2023 NHL standings and Stanley Cup winner predictions. Now with the NHL season coming super close to starting, I wanted to lock in my predictions for every single NHL team to see where they could finish both in the regular season and potentially in the NHL playoffs. But where do I see your favorite team finishing and who do I eventually see winning the Stanley Cup in the 2023 season? Watch till the end for all the predictions for every team, and make sure to hit that subscribe button if you are new. 45% of you guys aren't subscribed, so if you like hockey content, this channel is the place to be. Now let's slide over to the rankings and start ourselves off with the 2023 standings to see which teams miss the playoffs, make the playoffs, how many points they get, what position they are in the divisions. As you can see, we got tiers here between President's Trophy division winners for each division. We got second in the division, third in the division, then the number one wild card for each conference, as well as the second wild card for each conference. Then we got fringe playoff teams, bottom 10 teams, and bottom 5 teams in the NHL this next year. Now, let's start off with the Pacific Division, seeing which teams go where, and obviously for me, I think it's the weakest division in the league, but I also feel like there is some strengths for them, especially at the top end. I think you got the Battle of Alberta being extremely intense this next year, but in terms of the number one team, in my opinion, in the Atlantic, I think that will go on to the Calgary Flames. I don't see them winning the President's Trophy, but I do see them just barely getting ahead of Edmonton, getting 108 points on the season, and my last predictions video was actually made right before the Tkachuk trade. So it was a situation where I didn't know what Calgary was going to really be that next year, but obviously since that prediction video, a lot has changed throughout the league, and it also changes in my predictions. At number 2 in the Pacific Division, I am going to go ahead and put the Edmonton Oilers at this spot, and to me, I think Edmonton has still a pretty strong chance at being number 1. I just have some still concerns with how consistent that goaltending will be and how the health overall for that roster will be, but at the same time, you'll have Evander Kane for the full season, and you'll have a lot of different additions that I think will help them both in the regular season and in the playoffs. Then going on to number 3, though, next up for the third spot in the Pacific, I got the LA Kings. I still think the Kings are pretty underrated, all things considered. I think most people will probably have them in a wild card position, but if the goaltending stays steady like Quick was last year, I think the Kings have a much healthier defense, hopefully this time around, and will have a lot more prospect youth coming up as well, and a pretty strong roster and forward group added on top with Kevin Fiala, which I think will make a big difference, especially on that power play. Going on to the first wildcard spot, and again, some divisions don't even have a wildcard team, but to me, I think there will be one team in the Pacific that does make the wildcard, and between the Vegas Golden Knights and the Vancouver Canucks, I think that's going to be the battle for that last playoff spot in the West, but to me, I just see the Vegas Golden Knights being able to get there and getting that first wild card, but actually, I guess they would be the second wild card in the West. Spoilers there. But I see the Vegas Golden Knights being around maybe 96 points, the Kings being maybe around 100, but I see the Golden Knights just being able to squeak in, maybe by just a single point. To me, obviously, there is big concerns with the health, especially with the goaltending, and to me, that'll be the biggest make or break for them, but I think it'll be okay, and considering still how good that roster can be when healthy, I think the Golden Knights will still be a playoff team, though with likely some limited success. Then going on to the fringe playoff teams in the Pacific, and to me, there's a bunch here, a couple of teams that are really in that 90-point threshold, and the first team is the Vancouver Canucks, who I see maybe being a point, maybe 2 points shy of the Golden Knights, but I see finishing around 92 points and still being in the race, but maybe in that last week, trailing a little bit, and the Golden Knights eventually getting ahead. Next up in number at the 6th spot in the division, I got the Anaheim Ducks. To me, they're a team that will finish at 89 points, still being pretty solid, but all things considered, not being enough to make that playoffs quite yet, but I do think in 2024, that's the year where they could make that jump. And then going on to the last 2 spots in the Pacific, next up, I got the Seattle Kraken at 85 points. They're a team that I see doing better, and the rebounding of hopefully their goaltending, I think will take them a long way. I mean, Grubauer was easily the worst goalie in the league this year, or last year, and if he's even league average, the Kraken were a much better team, and I think with the additions of Burakovsky and Bjorkstrand and Matty Beniers having a full rookie season, I think that Kraken offense will be much improved as well. Then going on to the last spot, though, to me, at the number 8, I have the San Jose Sharks. I see them finishing with 70 points, being one of the worst teams in the league, still having some competent parts, and I think that goaltending will be pretty strong for them, all things considered, but still not enough to be close to a playoff spot. But now we got the Pacific Division locked and loaded. Let's go on to the Central Division, another division that at some points is pretty predictable, but at others, especially in the middle, it's the Wild West for a good reason. But coming in at the number 1 spot, to me, the team that'll win the President's Trophy in 2023, I got the Colorado Avalanche. Of course, you have had some losses here or there, but personally, I think that goaltending in Alexander Georgiev is actually going to be pretty great and will be an advantage for them in some ways, but I just feel like a lot of that foregroup and that defense especially will take some bigger next steps. So if Bowen Byram, for example, really adding on to things, there will still be some questions over if they actually win the Stanley Cup, but I think they'll still be the best team in the league for the regular season. Coming in at second, though, in the Central, next up, I have a team that some people might not have as high, but at the second position, I have the Minnesota Wild, a team that I see getting 104 points on the year, just being slightly below Edmonton in terms of points for that second division mark, but at the same time, I feel like this is one of the last years where Minnesota is truly at the peak with this roster. You'll still have Kirill Kaprizov leading the way in so many different attributes, but at the same time, you'll have a full season of Fleury. That defense can still be great at points, and to me, I think the Wild will be good enough to get that second spot. Going on to number 3, and to me, it's between St. Louis and Nashville for this, but continually, I just feel like the Nashville Predators are going to be in this position and will eventually get the third spot in the division. It'll be extremely close between number 3 and number 4, but I see the Preds being just like the Kings at 100 points, and to me, I think a lot of it comes down to that goaltending with Lankin and I think rebounding, and UC Charles being among the best in the league, and Roman Josi continuing to be at that level, and most of that forward group being as good as it is with additions like Nino Niederreiter and on that defense, Ryan McDonough. I think the Preds will be pretty excellent, and even though, again, there might not be amazing playoff success, I see them doing pretty well in the regular season. Then going on to the 4th spot and going on to the number 1 wild card in the West, I have the St. Louis Blues. To me, I see the Blues finishing with 99 points, just a point shy of the Preds, and to me, it comes down to the goaltending difference. I just do not believe that Binnington and Greiss are going to be good enough to get the Blues in a further position in the Central, and to me, that tandem is kind of one of the more make or break factors for the Blues in that Central Division, in all honesty. Then going on to number 5, and sadly, my favorite team, I see them missing the playoffs and being, I guess, one of the better teams to do so at 95 points, 1 point shy of the Vegas Golden Knights, but I think for the Stars, I think they'll be a fringe playoff team with Jason Robertson, but if that contract situation goes into the season, I don't think there's a good chance at all the Stars are able to make it. Then moving on to number 6 in the Central, one of the better teams as well to miss the playoffs, I got the Winnipeg Jets, and they will be a team that is just bottom 10, maybe 10th in 10 or bottom 10 in the league. That's I guess 22nd spot if you want to go with a technicality. But to me, I see the Jets finishing with 89 points, same as the Ducks, but the Ducks may be getting a tiebreaker there. But to me, I think for the Jets, even though Rick Bowness might do some good things there, to me, their roster just is not good enough right now. And unless Connor Hellebuck is back to an unreal level, Vezina level, I see the Jets still being on the outside looking in. Then going on to the bottom couple of spots in the Central, this to me is absolutely decided. It'll be between the Blackhawks and the Coyotes, but the order in which they go, will the Coyotes or Blackhawks be worse? And to me, just slightly, I have the Chicago Blackhawks just being above the Coyotes by maybe a point. I see the Blackhawks getting 53 points on the year and the Coyotes getting 52 points on the year, but both of those teams being among the worst and the worst in the league. But now we got the Western Conference done, let's move on to the East and start off with the Metro Division and the predictions for all the Metro teams. And let's start out with the number 1 spot and the team that is just behind Colorado, in my opinion, for being involved in that President's Trophy race. I got the Carolina Hurricanes. Now, for me, I see the Canes finishing with 110 points, so I guess they technically be above the Calgary Flames. But to me, I see the Canes being among the best top 3, top 5 in the league, and hopefully with that health, hopefully sticking strong, I feel like the Canes could be in a great position. Obviously, losing Max Pacioretty hurts that offense a lot, and that might be maybe the biggest weakness for them, but I think Brent Burns is going to do pretty well in a new situation, and I think some of the additions they did make were still pretty great for them, and I think that goaltending will hold still pretty strong, especially in the regular season. Then going on to number 2, I have a team that I feel like some people are also kind of underrating regular season-wise in the New York Rangers. I see them finishing second in their division, and being along the Oilers, I see the Oilers finishing 107 points, I see the Rangers finishing with that exactly as well, but to me, I think think Igor Shesterkin is going to solidify himself as the best goaltender in the league this next regular season, and I think in some spurts, the Rangers will be able to replicate some of the magic they had last year. They obviously lost a lot of depth, but you still add on players like Vincent Trocheck, and hopefully we'll see players like Kako, Lafreniere, Keontae Miller take even bigger steps this next year, and I see the Rangers still being among the best in the East. Then going on to number 3. Next up, I have the Pittsburgh Penguins at the 3rd spot in the division, and they'll be, I guess, the best team for now in that 3rd spot. But to me, I think the Penguins are still going to hold pretty strong. A lot of that comes down to the coaching. I think they lost some depth in the offseason still, but at the same time, they made some big moves onto that defense, which I think are welcome. Even if I'm not the biggest fan of Jeff Petrie at this stage in his career, I think in Pittsburgh, that's a situation that could benefit him quite a bit. And of course, you add Ty Smith onto that as well, which I think could be a really interesting addition for the offensive and power play side of the defense. But I think Tristan Jarry is just going to continue to get better. And for now, that Pens core will still be strong with Crosby, Malkin, and Letang hopefully staying healthy. But going on to the 4th spot and going on to the number 1 wild card in the East, next up I have the Washington Capitals, who I see finishing of 100 points in the year, just a point above the Blues to get that upper spot in the number 1 wild cards. But to me, I still see the Capitals doing well, even though you do lose, of course, a big one in Backstrom for most of the year, most likely. You're still going to have Kuznetsov, and I think Dylan Strome in a top 6 center role has proven with Chicago that he can be great at times. The consistency is an issue. We'll see how that affects things in Washington. But you, of course, add Darcy Kemper, which I think was a much-needed change to bring some, hopefully, stability onto that goaltending tandem. And I think the Caps will have some great regular season success because of it. Then going on to number 5 in the Metro, and now on to the 2nd wild card in the East, in my opinion. Next up, I have the New York Islanders, who I just see getting the 2nd wild card spot in the East, 97 points on the year. And to me, I think a lot of it goes on to that defense and goaltending. I think Ilya Sorokin will win the Vezina Trophy next year and will probably be in the race for the MVP, especially if the Islanders are able to make the playoffs. And I could see him getting a 930, 931 save percentage and being among the best out there. And I think that defense has a lot of potential for a rebound season. You still have most of that core there, and I think 2022 was an iffy year for them and a pretty fluky one. And I think most of the offense with Lane Lambert will hopefully be rejuvenated, and I think you'll see some of that factor into the regular season. Next up, going on to number 6, and unfortunately a team that could take a bigger step maybe if they were in the Pacific, but of course being in the East does not help things. I have the New Jersey Devils, who I see being one of the better teams as well to miss the playoffs, getting 91 points on the year and being pretty close. Now the Ducks would have 89 points, so I guess the Devils will be above them. But to me, I think it again comes down to the goaltending. You have a goaltending tandem of Mackenzie Blackwood and Vitek Vanacek, and to me, even though I really have loved Blackwood and even Vanacek at times in the past, I'm just not sure compared to some of the other East teams if that will be good enough. And even though the defense is improved and you do have some good additions on that offense like Palat and hopefully Holtz in his rookie year, I'm just not sure if it's enough for the Devils to be a playoff team yet. But in 2024, kind of like Anaheim, I think they'll hopefully take that next step officially. Then going on to the 7th spot in the Metro, another team that I think could maybe be a contender in the West, but being in the Metro is pretty hurtful for them. I have the Columbus Blue Jackets, a team that I think will be a bottom 10 team in the league, and compared to Seattle, who will have 85 points, I think Columbus will have 86 points on the year and just be behind Winnipeg in the overall standings race. But to me, even though I love the additions of Gaudreau, and I think for now, Goodbranson could help that defense a little bit, I still think there's a lot of depth issues on the roster, and also at the same time, that defense, I haven't seen enough to where that defense really changes defensively for the better, and until that happens, I think the Blue Jackets will be on the fringe or even lesser than that. Then going on to number 8 right now, I mean, there's very little doubt in my opinion the Flyers will be a bottom 5 team in the league. To me, I think with Philadelphia, even though Tortorella will factor him in some ways and could help the roster a little bit, I think they'll get 71 points in the year, for instance. I still think they're going to be absolutely garbage, and especially when you consider the health issues they're having to deal with, and that roster already not being that great with perfect health. To me, I think Philadelphia will again miss the playoffs and have another pretty lackluster year. But now let's move on to the Atlantic. But now moving on to the heavily talked about Atlantic division, and to me, you could go so many different ways with it, and it really is going to be an interesting division to see how it completely plays out in both the bottom, mid, and bottom, really. But to me, going into the number 1 spot, although it's been talked about a lot, I still think the Toronto Maple Leafs are going to be a great regular season team. I see them finishing of 109 points in the year, just being behind Carolina in terms of the division winners. And there's so much talk about Toronto and how that goaltending could pan out. But to me, I think it'll still be good in the regular season, and the Leafs will still be a great team in the regular season. Obviously, playoffs are a different story, but to bet against the Leafs being good in the regular season, I just can't do that, and I don't think they lost enough to where I'm really worrying about their number one spot in the Atlantic. Next up, going on to number 2, and the team right behind them, I have the Tampa Bay Lightning, who I see finishing of 109 points on the, or 107 points in the year, which would put them just along Tampa, or Edmonton and New York range. But to me, when it comes to the Bolts, I still like a lot of that roster. The goaltending is still among the best, with Andre Vasilevsky leading the way. That defense, in my opinion, although you do lose McDonough, still has some great attributes. And that forward group still, when healthy, is one of the best out there. And regular season wise, I think they'll still show up in many ways. Then going on to number 3, this is a team that I have seen a lot of people say is going to miss the playoffs. And as crazy as that would be, I still see the Florida Panthers making the playoffs and being third in the division. Now, I see them getting 102 points on the year, which would put them just above LA, but right behind, actually, would they be behind Pittsburgh? Yes, they would. Pittsburgh would get 104 points, with Florida getting 102. But to me, I think even though there is some holes, especially with that defense, to me, that forward group is still among the best. That top 6 is still among the best, and I think Matthew Tkachuk's going to have a great year for them. I think the goaltending, Spencer Knight has looked incredible, especially in the preseason games we've seen, and with Bobrovsky being pretty rejuvenated last year, I think that goaltending tandem could be pretty underrated. Even though Florida, I don't think will have too much playoff success still, I think they'll still be good in the regular season and good enough to get a top 3 spot. Next up at number 4, and unfortunately a team that will miss the playoffs, but just barely for me, I have the Ottawa Senators being at this spot. I see them getting 96 points on the year, but unfortunately just missing, but being the best team in the league to miss, right above Dallas and Vancouver. But to me, when it comes to the Sens, I mean, you now have the news of Cam Talbot being out for the next 7 months, which is 7 weeks, which is absolutely brutal for them. Even though I do think Anton Forsberg is pretty underrated, if that health continues to be an issue, that could be major for the Sens. And considering how weak that defense could be, even though that top 6 and that top 9 could be really strong, I still think for the Sens, kind of like, again, Anaheim and New Jersey, it might have to be another year of waiting before they're back in the playoffs. But now moving on to number 5, the team right behind them, I have the Boston Bruins. I see them finishing with 96 points, again, just like Ottawa, being right in that race. But to me, it's going to be one of those situations where it all depends on those first couple months of the season. If they're like 500 by the time that McAvoy and Marchand and Grzelcyk come back, I could see the Bruins making the playoffs. But the problem is, with how tight that Atlantic division, with how tight that East is, I don't see the Bruins doing well at all in those first couple of months and suffering because of it. But now moving on to number 6, I have the Detroit Red Wings. I see them finishing with 86 points in the year, just being a bottom 10 team in the league, but being around Columbus range. To me, it's kind of unfortunate because I do think Detroit's trying to take a lot of advantage of their situation with their cap space, and obviously the free agency for them I thought was absolutely incredible. But at the same time, I still think there are some pretty big holes with that depth on the forward group, with that defense still in many ways, and the goaltending is rather questionable. I mean, Ville Husso was great last year, but same thing was with Nedeljkovic the year before he got traded to Detroit, and we saw how his year went for the Red Wings, but we'll see in a tandem system how it's able to work for both guys. I think it'll still be a pretty solid season for them, and hopefully another solid year for the young guys, but I think, again, I'm a broken record, but kind of like Anaheim, I think Detroit will have to wait until they take that bigger step into being a 90-plus point team. Next up, let's go on to number 7, and next up, I have the Buffalo Sabres. I see them finishing with 78 points and just being outside that bottom 5, but to me, I think when it comes to the Sabres, they're in a really interesting spot. To me, all that matters is keeping that morale high and keeping the spirits up for the Sabres, even though I think it'll be still a pretty rough season for them, especially with how weird that goaltending could be and how still rough that defense is. To me, I think for the Sabres, as long as the young guys continue to show up and improve and get better, I think it's still a successful season for Buffalo. And then going on to the last team on the list, next up, I have the Montreal Canadiens. I see them finishing with 58 points on the year, being a bottom 3 team, and although not being as bad as Chicago or Arizona, I would honestly not be surprised if they're near that range, considering how stacked the East is. But yeah, considering their defense, their forward group, their goaltending, it's going to be a rough year for the Habs, but by design. Now let's quickly go over what we could see in the playoffs. I got all the matchups here loaded up, and the first one in the West is the Colorado Avalanche versus the Vegas Golden Knights. And you can see I got some tiers here of first round loss, second round loss, conference final runner-up, Stanley Cup finalist, and eventual Stanley Cup winner. But going on to the Avs and Golden Knights, as much as I would love to see the Golden Knights somehow surprise and get the win versus Colorado, there is absolutely no way the Vegas Golden Knights would be able to win that series. I say the Avs win in 5. I'll give the Golden Knights a pity win, but really, especially that goaltending, I don't see them lasting too far. Then going on to the next matchup, though, and the second and third seed in the Central, you got the Minnesota Wild versus the Nashville Predators, and I think this could be maybe a more tight series than some people might expect, but I still go Minnesota on this one, though I do see it going 7 games and being a really tight one, especially with how good that Predators goaltending is, but I do think Fleury and the Wild will eventually get the edge. Then going on to the first spot in the Pacific with the first wild card, I got the St. Louis Blues, or the Calgary Flames versus the St. Louis Blues, and to me this would be a really hard-hitting, really tight series. Again, kind of like what we saw with Calgary and Dallas actually this last year. But to me, it again comes back to the goaltending and comes back to some of the depth, and to me, Calgary is in a really great position over these next few seasons. Although I do see it going 6 games, I see the Blues eventually losing in the first round and being among the losers in the opening round. And then moving on to the next matchup, a rematch of what we saw in the first round of this last year, Edmonton versus LA. I do think just like that last year, it'll be pretty close, especially if Jonathan Quick pulls out some more magic. But I do see Edmonton continuing to be just a solid team in the playoffs, at least recently, and eventually moving on to get that win. And I would say probably in 5 or 6 games, but the Kings, I think, will still put up a pretty good fight. Then going on to the Eastern Conference matchups, Keynes versus Islanders. I really like this matchup in a lot of different ways, but I do feel like the Keynes will just barely eventually get that win. But I see it going 7 games, and the Islanders continuing to prove how good of a playoff team they are. Next up, another first round matchup of 2022. We got the Rangers and the Penguins, and to me, I just cannot bet against the Penguins losing in the first round. It's too much of an inevitability to not have the Rangers winning this series. To me, especially with some of the improved young play, I could see the Rangers doing still pretty well in the playoffs this next year and still advancing on to round 2. And then going on to a couple more matchups, we got Toronto versus Washington, a first round matchup of 2017, and this one would be so much fun to watch. But to me, this is kind of a really interesting matchup for the Leafs as well. But with Backstrom likely being healthy back at that point in the playoffs, I could see a situation where Washington potentially wins this series, of course, with the Toronto Maple Leafs first round woes. But at the same time, considering how weak that defense can be defensively for Washington, I still see the Toronto Maple Leafs winning that series. But I think it'll go 6 games, and the Leafs will eventually slay their demons. But I think the Capitals were the type of team that they needed to face in 2022, but 2023 doesn't hurt either. And then we go on the last matchup of the first round. We got another matchup here and another rematch. We got Lightning versus Panthers, and to me, I kind of go back and forth on this one, considering how much mileage the Lightning have, but also considering how much the Lightning have owned the Panthers over these past couple of seasons. I see that continuing, and I see also some of the inconsistencies in that defense really haunting the Panthers once again. But we got some amazing matchups here in the second round. First up, we got Avs versus Wild, and to me, this will be a really interesting one. And this might be a little bit of a hot take, but I see this series going 7. To me, I think the Wild will give up a heck of a fight, and I think Marc-Andre Fleury is going to be really, really good in this series too. And I kind of go back and forth on who would actually win it, because I do feel like with Colorado, even though Georgiev is solid, I still think in the playoffs there might be some issues there. And this might be crazy to say, but I want to feel a little bit of an upset here. I'm going to say the Avalanche lose in the second round, and mostly because of Fleury and that really star-studded top end offense for the Wild, especially with Marco Rossi and Matthew Boldy getting accustomed to things. I think the Wild will do pretty well in the playoffs for 2023, and it being one of the last years they can truly go for it. I think we could see some trade deadline acquisitions, and that come through a lot for them in 2023, while the Avalanche don't have many really options to add onto the roster. So I see the Wild just winning it, and a lot of that being because of the clutchness of some of their specific players. But now let's move on to the Battle of Alberta, another rematch here, and it's great to see every single time, absolutely. And I go back and forth on this, and it's been a question over the offseason of who would win in a playoff matchup, the Flames or the Oilers, and to me, I go back and forth on it, but it also goes back to the Flames of last year and how a lot of the key players weren't able to show up, specifically Jacob Markstrom, and I think Jack Campbell is in a really unique situation with Edmonton, and to me, I see the Flames losing again to the Oilers in the second round, mostly because of maybe some of the goaltending differences, as well as Connor McDavid, as good as he was last year, continuing to do that, and could be somehow even better next year. So, let's go on to the Eastern Conference second round matchups. Next up, we got Keynes versus Rangers, another good rematch here, and to me, I go back and forth on it, but I'm going to go out on a limb a little bit here, and especially with Max Pacioretty healthy, I see the Carolina Hurricanes winning this series and winning it in 7, being extremely close, but I do think some of the additions on that offense are definitely needed, and that addition of Max Pacioretty, I think come playoff time, will help them quite a bit. Then going on to Leafs versus Lightning. And this is the problem, because if that goaltending for the Leafs really turns a page and they're able to get past the first round, I see the losing this series. And that's the thing. I think for the Lightning, they were the perfect team, or I guess for the Leafs, it was the worst team for them to face last year in the first round in a lot of different ways of how clutch the Lightning were. But I think once the Leafs get past that first round, if they ever do, I think they're going to go on a really interesting run. And I think for the Lightning, I think that mileage will catch up to them a little bit, especially on that defense, and I think the Leafs will just be able to get through and maybe win a game 7. We'll see. But now we go on to the conference finals. We got Minnesota versus Edmonton. I guess it would be Edmonton getting the home ice advantage there, and Carolina versus Toronto, though a crazy top 4 in all honesty. But to me, when we look at the Western Conference final, to me, it easily goes to the Edmonton Oilers. I see them winning that series maybe 5 or 6 games, but Connor McDavid continuing to be unbelievable and being a main reason why they will go on to the Stanley Cup final. And then going on to the East, and I look at this series with the Canes and the Leafs, and to me, I think the Canes are just an amazing matchup for the Leafs in a lot of different ways. Well, a horrible one if I'm choosing my words correctly. I think the Canes would match up well against Toronto in a lot of different areas, especially when it comes to that defense and some of the forwards that they do have. But obviously, that goaltending is still a question mark in the playoffs, especially with how Freddie Anderson's health went. But I do think the Canes have just a little bit of a special edge this next year, and I'm going to have the Canes moving on to the Stanley Cup final and the Wild and the Leafs losing in the conference final. But we got a matchup for a rematch of the 2006 Stanley Cup final. Again, I'm going to go Carolina versus Edmonton, but to me, I go back and forth on this. I feel like there's so much that could happen for either team, but again, it all comes back to the health, in my opinion. Will the Canes still be fully healthy going into the last round of the playoffs? I'm not sure about that, especially their goaltending and the history of some of their players, and to me, that could be a deciding factor. But to me, I think it'll go the distance. I think it will go 7 games, and I might be going out on a horrible limb here. Horrible limb. But I am going to say that the Edmonton Oilers win the Stanley Cup and the Carolina Hurricanes are the Stanley Cup finalists. Though, again, considering Edmonton, of course, is a Canadian team, that it isn't a great bet to make. But at the same time, I feel like Edmonton, with everybody fully healthy, is one of the better rosters out there and one of the better rosters for the playoffs. And I think Connor McDavid is literally going to will his way to a cup win eventually. And I think 2023 is the year to get it done, especially with the additions on the goaltending and the overall roster. I think it'll be enough to get there, with also some additions on that defense and hopefully a pretty active trade deadline. I think the Oilers will be in a great position and will win the 2023 Stanley Cup. Call me crazy. But that'll be it for today, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you did enjoy, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell if you haven't already. Comment down below, what do you guys think of my rankings? What do you agree and disagree with? And let me know as well what you guys think for the 2023 playoffs. Who wins the Stanley Cup this next year? Let me know all your thoughts down below. And of course, share this video with your friends. Get the standings predictions out there. And click this card for all my hockey predictions content right in one playlist. My name is Nathan. Have a great day. And I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.